I love the lyrics of that song. I asked, Brad and I decided that'd be a good song. As you all know, I guess I'll just do it this way. I don't think I need that mic. I wanted to read those lyrics again, just a little bit of it, because they speak, as our songs often do, to kind of what I want to think about today. Because you know it makes you cry, because you can't see what's passed you by. Because you feel, but you can't decide. You feel you can't decide among the living. Crumbling as they do, crumbling as they fall among the living. So there's this melancholy sense in the song that seems like we just can't figure out how to be present or how to live in our moments. And I think that's really what our text is speaking about today. Our text is speaking about this idea of how do we live differently today. Now, the text for the lectionary, the other one that was going to be read was 1 Corinthians. We didn't read that one. It's a really interesting pairing up. They usually try to pair up an Old Testament and a New Testament, sometimes a Psalms, and then a gospel. So there might be a letter of Paul, then there might be a gospel, and then the others. So the letter from Paul was for 1 Corinthians, so it was his first letter to the church at Corinth, which was an interesting topic because he was talking to the church at Corinth about their struggles, their fights over what does it really mean to be resurrected. Because Jesus has now died, resurrection has happened, and a lot of people aren't even sure what that was or what that meant or who or how it happened. So there's just a lot of testimonies, a lot of stories about it. And then Paul goes through this long, convoluted, sort of almost Platonic Greek discussion of bodies and spirits, and we're not resurrected in bodies, we're resurrected in spirit bodies. And then he kind of goes around in circles. If you understand the church at that time, it's a hierarchy. Right, the community, like Rome, is a hierarchy, and its orientation in that hierarchy is power. So the early church community, which were basically just followers of Jesus gathered in random communities, and they didn't all think the same, and they were all different in their different communities scattered all about. And so they're gathered trying to be community. You get that? Trying to be equitable, trying to be sharing, trying to live together in community, in the midst of a power structure that is top-down, oppressive, caste-oriented. You have poverty, you have been poor, then you have labor, then you have a sort of a middle class, lower middle, and then you get up into the wealthiest and the most powerful. There's this orientation. Then Paul uses this word. He says, we are resurrected by the power of God. Our resurrection is in the power of God. I'll come back to that just because I thought it was an interesting pairing up, and I never did want to talk about resurrection, but now I'm going to kind of get into it a little bit. In particular, though, I want to think about this idea of undoing what seems impossible, undoing the impossible. And how do we live into this idea of what seems like impossible? Does it even speak to what we do? I don't know if I read that as I was reading the scripture, if you did a little mental checklist. If you just literally thought about it a little bit, loving my enemies. Yeah, sure, I kind of do that. Not really, though. If you put my enemy in front of me, I don't think I'd like them. I don't think I could love them. Or how many of you, if somebody takes something, you want to send them a note and say, listen, I just hope you're enjoying it. You don't do that? I knew a woman literally who lived in a neighborhood that got robbed a lot. She left her door unlocked and a note on the table when she was going to be gone for any period of time, and she said, please take what you need. Just don't destroy the place. Just take what you want. And she lived that way. She didn't usually end up with a lot of stuff missing, but she would occasionally end up with stuff. So these ideas, don't judge others. I mean, even in the smallest way, somebody does something that ticks us off, and we make just a little bit of a judgment, just a little bit of an opinion there. Or maybe we're judging people online all the time. So I told this story a long time ago. It's a perfect story. I apologize if you heard it before. Those of you who haven't heard it, I think you'll like it. It really speaks to what I want to share with you today. How do we find ourselves living in relationship to one another, navigating not just how a normal life, how to live among our friends and people that are familiar, how do we navigate our lives in the reality that we live in? Not just its divisiveness, also its isolation, its sense of isolation at times. How do we live meaningfully in this? So this is one of my stories. So this guy goes into a town, and he doesn't know what the town is like, so he wants to get to know what the town is like. And he knows best way to get to know this town, a small town out kind of in the middle of nowhere, go to the bar, talk to the people, you get to know them. So he walks into the bar, And, oh, by the way, can I say horse's ass in here? Does that bother anybody? Okay, if it does, I'm sorry, I just said it. I'm going to say it. It's better for the story, and who here hasn't used that phrase a time or two? Who hasn't been the object of that phrase a time or two? So he walks in, and he goes into the bar, and he stands there at the bar, and he looks around, and he decides this is going to work. So he says, every last Republican is a horse's ass. And they grab him up, beat him up, everyone in the room, throw him out in the street, and he smiles as he stands up and says, I think I know who these people are. So he walks back in, stands at the bar the next day, and he says proudly and confidently, every last Democrat is a horse's ass. Then suddenly they all grab him up. Everyone in the bar, they grab him up, they beat him up, they throw him out in the street. He stands up, he's shaking his head. Some guy comes out from the bar, he says, I don't get it. He looks at the guy in the bar, he says, I don't get it. The guy in the bar says, no, you don't. This is horse country. I don't think we get it. That's really the point of this text. We don't get it. We're so binary oriented. We're so conditioned to see everything in a certain way that even when we're enlightened and educated and analytical, we don't get it because we still go to where we are most comfortable and conditioned in our brain. And it's so hard to think counterintuitively, to think outside of binaries. It is really challenging. But I think that's what this is. And that's why I said in my e-blast, if you read that, if you got it and you read that, I said, God must love a good mystery. Because why else would Jesus say something so ridiculous and impossible as loving your enemy? Or as praying for those who are persecuting you? Or as forgiving those who are abusing you? Or giving to those who take from you? You know, I mean, why else would Jesus say such ridiculously crazy things that are impossible to do? Back then, and seemingly no less now. God must really love a mystery. So I came up with a couple of phrases, starting lines to some good mysteries. Any good story is basically a mystery. Now, not necessarily an Agatha Christie kind of mystery or a Robert Mosley kind of mystery, but any good story has a mysterious element to it because it starts with something that hooks you and you want to know what's going to happen. You're interested. You ever think of your own story that way? You know, what would be the opening line of your story? What would be the hook in your story that would get other people interested? I think the problem there is not so much that we're worried about, I think we need to get interested in our own story. Not worry about what other people do. It's getting interested in our own story and living out of that, because I think God loves a good mystery. You see what I'm saying? We participate, co-create. Marley was dead to begin with. Right? Know that one? Christmas Carol? Okay. Here's one of my favorite. I put this one in the e-blast. It's Garrison Keillor, Pontoon. I love this one. Evelyn was an insomniac. So when they say she died in her sleep, you had to question that. What a great twist of words he had. Some of these you might remember. You better not tell nobody but God. You know that one? Alice Walker, Color Purple. You know the story, right? Think about that introduction now. You've read the story, look back at the beginning. You better tell nobody but God. Wow. She really knew how to start that story off. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness. We know that one. Tale of Two Cities. Here's one, see if you remember this one. The story so far. In the beginning, the universe was created. This made a lot of people very angry. And it's been widely regarded as a bad move. Know this one, right? Douglas Adams. Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Great book. So here's some other random ones. Because I've written children's books and stuff, I have this story generator that starts off with storylines. A lot of them are just prompts, but they're also sort of suggested storylines. And so these are some of my favorite. Every night, Peter went out to save the world in his own little way. I have always been the odd one out until last night when the weird one showed up. I like that one. 3 times now she almost died and no one noticed. Something there. So here's something that I want to suggest that this might be the start of what I'm talking about when I say God loves a mystery, a good mystery. Looking back now, all these years later, and no one believed this could have happened when all he said was, love your enemies. So we have this graphic, next one. We know Nelson Mandela. Unknown conditions ahead. It's kind of the story of life if you think about it, right? It's kind of the story of all of our lives. And yet, it's hard for us to get there because our brains are not designed for that, right? Our brains are designed for default. Our brains are designed to operate our bodies. I mean, that's basically the neurology of our brain. When we first evolved, our brain was simply to make this thing work in its best efficient way and in the conditions we're given. So it's adaptive. Now, as we evolved, the brain evolved, right? And so as we get more and more evolved in our culture, in our society, industrial enlightenment, all those things should be some level of evolvement of the brain as well. But the thing is that the brain, again, is deeply, deeply designed in its deepest sense of its structure to simply work off default. And because when we're young or infants, we grow up in a certain culture with a certain experience, whatever that context is, however that story began, because we grow up in that, we have a hard time ever thinking outside of that conditioning. It's really challenging for us. And some of the most difficult challenges are the ones that are experienced and accepted non-verbally and culturally, societally, like thinking in terms of good and evil, thinking in terms of bad and good or right and wrong, thinking in terms of binaries, any kind of binary, this or that. Very difficult for us to wrap our heads around this idea of something as being non-dual and interdependent and interconnected because we experience everything as dualities. We experience everything as wrong and right, and this is broken, needs fixing. There's definitely some importance to that. There's definitely a place for that. But at the same time, it's about the horse country. It's about the bigger picture. When Jesus says, love your neighbor as yourself, pray for your enemy and love your enemy, he's really saying it's a different picture. It's not about the binary. And that's hard for us to get around. Now, I'm a 4 on the Enneagram. Some of you all know what the Enneagram is. I'm a 4 on the Enneagram. That means I'm basically kind of an individualist. I'm introspective. They call it romantic. I'm not romantic in the traditional sense. Linda went like, what, you? No, but it's the kind of person who sort of sees things idealistically and spends a lot of time in there. We're motivated by shame. Several of the Enneagram, there's triads, out of 9, there's 3 different sections of triads. And so the 4s, the 2s, 3s, and 4s, are motivated by shame. Now, a lot of this you don't know, but just know that I'm motivated by shame. I've talked about this before. So you can tell me how much you loved the sermon. I'm still going to go home, take it apart, and hate myself. Literally go, it sucked. Linda said, how'd it go? I said, standing ovation. She said, great. I said, no. I forgot to include this. I don't know why I said that. What was I start taking it apart. I'm motivated by shame. It's how I grew up, the context I grew up in. Now, not as much so now because I've really been working on it over the years. I'm also a 5. I'm literally split between a 4 and a 5. A 5 is somebody who loves presenting, a proclaimer. They love ideas. They're intellectual. They like studying things. I'm a 5. 5's motivation is fear. That's what they have to learn how to integrate. They're afraid of things. 5, 6, and 7s, they're afraid. I'm always afraid, and then I feel ashamed, and then I'm afraid. Right? So you wouldn't be surprised to say I grew up in a family of hypochondriacs. I was a class hypochondriac. So as I was growing up, and even in my middle adulthood, the shame and the fear, the anxieties that we don't really know why we do the things we do, we end up doing them, they get in some trouble. Why am I always depressed? Why do I always fall in this pattern? Why I always do this? We don't really know why we keep falling in the holes we fall in. It's because of these inner core motivations that we really haven't addressed. Last week I talked about the deeper well and how sometimes we really are invited to pull things up into our consciousness out of these deeper wells of our being so that we can reflect on them. The challenge is they look scary sometimes. And our brain doesn't want to go there because it's uncomfortable. But so I was always uncomfortable because where does fear go? Where does anxiety go? Where does shame go? It goes somewhere in the body. If you're not bringing it up to your consciousness, it's going somewhere in the body. So my body was always broken. Lo and behold, when I finally figure out that's what I was doing to myself, I start getting older, your body starts breaking naturally, right? So didn't even get to use it when it was good. I was going to every doctor for everything. I swear I had tumors all over. I really did. I would go to the doctor because I had a tumor in my stomach. I would go to the doctor because I felt a new pain in my back. Linda would start going to the doctor with me. Because I am rooted in this fear and this shame, I could just work on this stuff. You know how you do this, especially at night. You get something going in your brain, you can't shake it. Then you start chasing the rabbit hole deeper and deeper and deeper. And then it's just like amazing if you can even just breathe and value yourself enough to go, okay, stop it. Bad neighborhood, need to get out of here. But I wouldn't. I'd go there, and so I'd go to the doctor. I'd schedule an MRI. I'd schedule a CAT scan. I'm being very vulnerable here right now, folks. I was very much kind of ashamed of all this, but I knew I was dying, and I had to have these things checked out. The worst part of it was that I went to a doctor just to do colonoscopy, do the usual kind of annual thing, 5-year thing, whatever. And then the doctor has the audacity to tell me, by the way, we did an MRI to make sure everything's okay. You have a spot on your pancreas. I'm a dead man walking. I told Linda, and it's like she's like telling the doctor because he's a member of the church. She's like, "Why did you do that?" My brother-in-law, who's a doctor, says everybody's got spots. They got spots all over them. Don't go looking. You just don't need to. So I went and I got it checked. Sure enough, there's a spot on the pancreas. I went and I talked to an endocrinologist, and he says, "You know what you can do?" Well, he's from Ireland too, by the way. He was from Northern Ireland. He says, "Well, now what we can do is I can do an endoscopic biopsy." We go in through the esophagus, we go into your stomach, we go into the pancreas through the stomach lining, we take a biopsy, we see what's there. Probably nothing to worry about, but we do it anyway, that way you'll be assured and you can be safe. And I said, "Well, what are the risks?" He says, "Well, you could get pancreatitis. You could have a stomach lining infection. It's an invasive procedure, but you do want to know, don't you?" And then he was like one of these doctors that are like some of my friends. He says, "It could kill you." So, that was my choice, right? So here's what I did, because it came at a time in my life when I realized I'm mostly wrong. That's where we get mixed up sometimes. We assume we're right because it's our default, but we're mostly wrong. We're mostly wrong about what we think other people think of us. We're mostly wrong about what we think of other people. We're ready to make a judgment, but people are bigger. Their stories are bigger than what we think about them. And even if we know what they did, their story's bigger than the worst thing they did. That's what it means. That's what God loves us means. Did you know that? That's what it means to be in the being of God's love. To have our life, our movement, our being in God's love. They're bigger than that worst thing. And so I was getting there already, and so I didn't do it. I also knew that my fear, and I still struggle with fear sometimes, but I also knew that my fears are 99.9% unfounded. And then I knew they sap all the potential life out of your moments. But that when you do start living in the moment, those fears start to dissipate. So I looked at the doctor and I said, "Now wait a minute, if I don't get the procedure, what's my option?" "Well, we could check you out every 6 to 8 months or so and see if the thing does anything. Do another x-ray." I said, "Oh, okay, I'll do that." So I just forgot about it. I just said, I know that I'm usually wrong about these things. I've been wrong almost, for the last 49, 50 years of my hypochondria. And so I just ignored it, and I went about my business. I went in, checked it, hasn't changed a bit. Look at that, the spot's the same size. And so I did it again another year later, and then I just stopped doing it. So that was about 8 years ago. My point being, though, in order to change who we are, we have to face our fears. In order to change our default positions on things, we have to challenge our fears. But the reality is that we are so easily swayed to go to our defaults that we are afraid to try what seems impossible. G.K. Chesterton, the author and critic and mystery writer himself back in the mid-century, 20th century, he said, it's not that Christianity hasn't been tried and failed. It's that Christianity is great, but nobody's tried it yet. Essentially, that's what he said. He says it's not that it's a bad thing or that it's lacking. It's that nobody's ever really tried it. When Jesus said, "Love your enemy," he was saying, like Paul, the resurrection is about a whole new way of seeing the world. It's not about this or that. It's horse country. It's about the kingdom. And how do you participate in the kingdom? You do crazy radical things, like loving your enemy. like giving up and letting people take what they take and going like, I hope you enjoy it. Or like Nasruddin Hoxha in the Middle East, when the thieves came and took what he had. He ran after him, followed him for a whole day until he caught up with them the next night. They said, what are you doing? He says, you got my stuff. I'm living with you now. Right? Do it. Go show up and say, you can keep it, but I'm coming over to use it every now and then. This guy approached me. I don't know if I told you this, but he approached me in Central Market the other day, wearing a onesie, 6'5", wearing a onesie outfit. I don't know what it was. It was kind of like a mechanic's outfit or something. It was gray and greenish gray, and it was tucked into his boots. And he wasn't wearing a mask, but he was 6'5". I was wearing a mask, and he was tall and lanky. He had his pants tucked in his boot, pushing around a cart. And I was trying to get something off the shelf to fix for dinner, and I was in a hurry. But he was crowding me out. One of those kind of things, just making me uncomfortable, right? One of those types. And I was like, and I was getting mad. But I caught myself, because that's what we do. If you're going to change the pattern, you have to catch yourself. You have to practice. It's a spiritual practice. It literally is something you have to practice. So I caught myself. And then he saw me stop. Must have been an invitation. Because he leaned into me and he said, you going to wear that mask in 7 years? And I felt affronted, right? Attacked, kind of like I knew what he was coming from. It felt aggressive. But I swear to you, if you can believe in the fact that his story is bigger than he's acting, and that the kingdom of God is bigger than both of us, then you can risk doing something different. And so I looked at him and I said, the real reason why I'm wearing my mask is because I just got through having bronchitis, and I don't want you to catch it. And he kind of went back a little bit, and his eyes opened up, and he said, well, okay, thank you. And then he kind of went about his business. And I was like, all right, that's cool. The challenge for us is to try to see the bigger reality and live into that. And that is so hard to do. Well, we'll finish up here with one last quote. I want to go to the end, because I didn't use any of the quotes that I put up there. I want to go to the very end. There we go. And this is a quote by one of my favorite writers and poets, David White, beautiful poet and writer. When I was in my first year of ministry, it was my first year to have a church of my own. I've talked about this church a little bit. It was a church south of Dallas, and I won't give you any of the information too specific, because I don't want you to go, I know that's that place. Because you'll automatically go there, right? He was talking about those people. He was talking smack about that church. I mean, we know who those people are. We just go there automatically and start judging. And I realized that's not really fair. They're bigger than their own story. But it was a painful reality, because they were basically a white flight community that had left the south part of Dallas because of the POC, people of color that were moving into the area, and it was becoming a changed economic area, and so they moved to an area where they built larger homes, nestled in a small community, isolated from the rest of the area around them. And that little town that had been there for 75 years, 80 years, they loved the ingrowth, and they were pretty much of the same ilk, if you will. And that was the church I got appointed to when I took my own church. And I came in, and I had all these ideas sort of out of the box, non-traditional, unorthodox kind of ideas. The sheriffs that were running for county sheriff, the two guys that were running for county sheriff, were both members of that church. They both took me out to lunch and supper on different occasions. They both asked, will you back me up? Will you support my campaign? And I said, I really can't, but I'll tell you what, I'm going to support both of you. And that just made them mad. And then they had the audacity to do something really crazy. They both happened to end up at the altar on Communion Sunday at the same time, sitting in line with several other people, but not next to each other, of course. And I had the audacity to make note of it. And I said, isn't this interesting? When we find out really what the kingdom's about, it's the leveling of the playing field. Because in God's eyes, we're all bigger than we think we are. We're all more than we think we are. We're all a part of the same community. And when we can live out of that, everyone is better off for the doing of it. And I said, so both of our candidates are right here. Neither one of them talked to me ever again after that. A couple of months later, I happened to notice something. I happened to notice that the cemetery, which was behind, it's always been behind the church there. It was the community cemetery. I never noticed that behind the row of trees was where the black cemetery was. And there was a little small dirt road that went along the fence that's kind of hidden by brush. I never noticed it because I never saw a funeral take place until one day I noticed there was a group of people going down that road. I was like, really? It's a separate cemetery still? We're talking the 90s? What? So I talked to church members. Wouldn't it be amazing if we just went out there and took that fence down? What would that say? And then when it came time to decide whether or not I would stay in that church, it was a 5-4 vote to keep me. I thought, wow, that's a celebration. 5-4. But it was a hard church to be in. It was tough for Linda to be, she was in another church serving over there, and it was just a difficult reality. Had I known what I know now, had I had that start to my story that said, he didn't realize this, but 20 years hence, he's going to look back and think, what a change it made to simply do that one thing, love your enemies. And I bet that church would have changed, and I would have changed too. It took me instead another 40 years to figure it out. I wish I had stayed. It was a difficult church. A friend of mine had come from South Africa because he hated his son going through apartheid. Church, he was appointed to that church. He called me up about 6 months in and said, I hope you didn't leave because of this church. This is a weird church. And then he went back to South Africa the next year. He said apartheid was easier. My point being, though, I missed an opportunity. I think what we come to realize is that the very ground of our being is shared in the possibilities of God's love, that every moment's more redemptive than we think because we haven't tried it. But when we do try it, when we do take a risk to get out of our normal grooves, out of our normal neurological thinking, and to challenge our own ideas about something, when we actually do that with humility and with the root word of love, which is, you know what that is? I've been teaching this. What is it? Curiosity. Has nothing to do with liking. That's something else. That's familiarity, comfort, and all that. Curiosity has to do, love has to do with cure. It's rooted in the same word, cura, to take care of, curiosity. If we approach life with more intentional curiosity, even in the difficult things, we invite a larger story. I guarantee it. To come to ground is to find a home in circumstances and in the very physical body that we inhabit in the midst of those circumstances. And above all, to face the truth, no matter how difficult that truth may be. To come to ground is to begin to have courageous conversation, to step into difficulty, and taking that first step, that risk, begin the movement through all the difficulties, begin the movement, to find the support and the foundation that has been beneath our feet all along. That's the bigger picture. It's not about the right and the left. It's all horse country. Amen.